I've heard it called the worst final boss ever, but today, for your consideration, a counter-argument. Final Fantasy IX is one of my favorite games in the entire franchise. It's roughly a three-way tie between 5, 9, and 10. I feel like most people think 9 is pretty decent too. Certainly I don't know that a lot of people hate it, but Necron, the final boss of Final Fantasy IX, doesn't share in that positivity to say the least. Necron is frequently lambasted for its spontaneous arrival at the end of the game, upending the status of Kuja as the final boss in place of this rather absurd, highly conceptual entity. As I said, I've definitely heard people call Necron one of the worst final bosses ever, if not the worst, and I think a lot of that is tied up in this. I'm not sure I want to meet it eye to eye, but let's take a good long look at Necron and see if this particular interpretation stands up to scrutiny. To get this part out of the way, no, I'm not here to talk about Necron the boss fight, which is... So, realistically, they only had so far they could go because... Necron has a... That was extremely cool what just happened. I literally got wiped in a single attack because of bad RNG. Even Ozma, the super boss, didn't quite get that bad, and I had stuff ready for this, just... Oh my god! Pretty awful in a very special way. Now, I didn't strategize for this super well, but there is one thing you cannot strategize your way out of anyway. Necron possesses an attack that can wipe your entire party. Grand Cross inflicts a wide array of status effects, including instant death, which cannot be truly stopped. It's rather bad from a strategy game design perspective to turn your entire strategy session for something into just pray that doesn't happen to you. But also, this is a channel about story. If you want to hear someone talk about gameplay, consult someone else who will tell you that it's flawless because nobody understands anymore that things you like, even things you consider your favorite, can in fact be imperfect. So to really get at the heart of what Necron's deal is, we have to talk about what Final Fantasy IX actually is. Final Fantasy IX is more than just the 9th mainline game in the increasingly ill-named Final Fantasy series. Final Fantasy IX is the first game explicitly meant as a tribute to its home series, released for the franchise's 10th anniversary. Sure, previous games had callbacks and repeating elements, but 9 went all in on this concept with way more shoutouts than usual. For the first time in a long time, the classic Black Mage appears as an actual playable character, alongside an entire species of Straw Hats who aren't identical to Vivi, but are otherwise identical to each other. Garnet appears early on wearing a traditional FF1 White Mage hood. The battle music features the return of the 2D era bass line. You know what I'm talking about, right? Zidane can find and remark upon the Buster Sword in a shop. The late-act sci-fi twist here is dialed up to possibly its most extreme yet. Sure, we went to the moon in FF4, but now we're going to another planet. Honest to Bahamut, interplanetary travel. We have 2 planets with civilizations, so we could have multiple moons with weird entities on them. The super boss's least annoying attack, not named Doomsday, is taken from FF6. I could go on, but you'd get bored and we'd forget why we're here. Meanwhile, Necron includes a couple all by itself, which we should start by digging into, and you will very quickly notice a theme between most of these. We'll start with the most superficial of these and talk about Necron's appearance, or maybe more like what its original appearance was going to be. This original piece of art was made by Yoshitaka Amano. No stranger to the Final Fantasy franchise, he's an artist whose style is marked frequently by an influence of psychedelia, no relation, and generally falls under a category that I would describe as 70s sci-fi fantasy art, which is not necessarily the most strictly accurate definition, but it shares a lot of aesthetic elements with several of the artists who painted those subjects in that era. You probably know quite a bit more art of this style than you think. A lot of it did make its way into popular culture through things other than the cover art of sci-fi novels and obscure games from the British Isles, even though those were pretty well saturated with the stuff. But artists like Joe Patano, Richard Clifton Day, and Michael Whalen have made quite a few well-known pieces. The work of comic book artist Mobius remains popular. And of course, let's not forget Roger Dean, who painted a lot of these lovely landscapes that appeared on 70s rock records, and to me has always just kind of been the artistic face of progressive rock. Him and Mark Wilkinson, I guess, but that's a different style. And yes, I would probably consider Frank Frazetta to be adjacent to this, and you have almost definitely seen a Frazetta in your life if you've seen any fantasy art from the second half of the 20th century. So call him the most famous example, I guess. Quite a lot of this art is not from the 70s or is grounded in other forms of fantasy besides sci-fi, but it all has one thing in common, which is that it goes particularly hard on the fantastical aspects of fantasy art. Amano is far from the only Japanese artist in this area, but he's definitely the one people know the best, thanks primarily to his work with the Final Fantasy franchise, which, if you hadn't heard, is absurdly popular and deserves a lot of credit for helping put Eastern RPGs on the map. Multiple times. Amano did most if not all of the original character designs for FF9. Amano always illustrates for these games even when he's not the chief character designer. His art style is iconic to the franchise and has been for long enough that they commission him for every other Final Fantasy game as well, and he does an excellent job bringing these character designs to life. Sometimes better than the original designers, but maybe that's because he's not really turning over so much concept art as someone like Nomura is. Unfortunately, the keyword there is original. This game had the character designs revised by Hideo Minaba, so this absolute banger of a design Amano submitted didn't really make it into the final game. In fact, Hideo Minaba's redesign is like the exact opposite of Amano's original. Fine quality, sure, but faceless, or at least wearing a mask, versus Amano's Necron basically just being a face. Actually, the retools of Amano's designs are probably the part of FF9 that makes me the saddest. I mean, look at the original version of Amarant, and while I don't really like Eiko very much no matter how she looks, Amano did at least turn in a version with a sensible and not unfortunate color palette. I suppose this doesn't really matter too much for our endeavors here, but I wanted to cover everything. If I'm already telling you the dead obvious fact of who Amano is at all, we may as well keep going, right? With that out of the way, it's time to dig into the story, because that's fundamentally where folks' complaints are rooted. The circumstances of Necron's appearance greatly resemble those of the Cloud of Darkness, a creature summoned by the major villain at the very end of the game after their defeat, with the primary goal of ending all existence. Unlike Necron, the Cloud of Darkness very obviously casts a long shadow over the game's story, actively manipulating Xande into, doing whatever evil... Okay, to be honest, FF3 is one of the few mainline Final Fantasies I haven't played very much of. I started on the DS version eons ago, then forgot about it, then sold it. I'm just looking this up on a wiki. But the point is that Necron's entire story weight really only kicks in right about when it's revealed. Necron has not put its metaphorical thumb on the scale in the way the Cloud of Darkness has, and even at most charitable, has just been watching the actions of some major players in the world of Final Fantasy IX, eventually deciding that Kuja's actions are proof that sentient creatures ultimately seek their own demise, and it's determined to give the people what they want. Necron's objective of bringing an end to all things is very similar to, well, many Final Fantasy villains, but perhaps most prominently that of Exdeath. Exdeath, the main villain of FF5, pleasant chap with a nice non-threatening name that he is, seeks his own end, along with that of all of reality. Exdeath's nihilism kind of scares me a little, actually, because it's seated so deep in who he is. His personality, his motives, the works, and most especially in his actions. Final Fantasy is one of those series that's very good at dialing this aspect of villains up to 11, especially with regard to this particular theme. Seymour, from Final Fantasy X, is a little bit the same, but I think he lacks a little of Exdeath's edge because it feels like he spends so much longer engaging in sophistry than Exdeath does. If there is any fundamental attribute I could assign to Final Fantasy as a franchise, it's anti-nihilism. Above all else, this is the thing Final Fantasy is about. Final Fantasy IX is more than just a celebration of 10 years of the Final Fantasy series. Final Fantasy IX is a culmination. Final Fantasy IX is the most Final Fantasy that the dev team could muster. Its classic style and unrelenting throwbacks are proof that this was the goal, but ultimately they're superficial. The bigger tell is how concentrated this overarching theme is to the game. Final Fantasy V had this as a similarly front and center theme. You'd have to be illiterate to not get what the game was about by the time you got to the end. But FF9 takes a slightly different tack from FF5. Instead of one single character seeking to eliminate reality, one character full of extreme nihilism, all of that is spread as despair over the cast. To go a little deeper, we need to look at one question that influences 6 of our major characters. Asking it makes them pause to think. Answering it becomes a drive. That question is, why live anyway? The main thread that ties our 6 most main characters, Amaranth and Quina get to sit this one out because their answers are fairly easy, is that they have to deal with a type of nihilism. Zidane's life has been a struggle, and he faced abuse in his childhood thanks to his boss and adoptive father. Finding out he was created to be an engine of destruction, he aims to realign this purpose. As Garnet watches what has become of her home kingdom, then witnesses its destruction, she is struck by such deep despair and such an extreme amount of survivor's guilt that it renders her mute for a time. Freya has to watch the genocide of her own people and discovers that her lover has lost most of his memories and forgotten her. And perhaps meanest of all, then basically drops out of story relevance entirely. To be forgotten is worse than death indeed. Vivi has to grapple with multiple existential crises throughout the story, first discovering that he was created to destroy, with very few other black mages being aware of anything at all. And once he meets some black mages who have become capable of independent thought, he also learns that he has a limited, and extremely short, lifespan, being more or less guaranteed to die in a few months' time. Eiko's entire storyline is about being alone, and the isolation has seriously screwed her up. And even though I hate her, I have to admit her circumstances are absolutely miserable. If all of humanity died out and you became the last human at or before the age of 6, you'd be a little screwed up too. And lastly, Steiner. Yes, even that hard-headed lunk, the Waka of FF9, Adalbert Steiner is put through a crisis of loyalty as he sees the evil his kingdom turns to and is struck having to process that it's practically only a bunch of lowlives he couldn't anticipate himself respecting who are trying to do anything to help. Which is a pretty accurate reflection of the real world at every point in history. Even the villains are not safe. That pompous bastard Kuja has an existential crisis over his mortality and is left running scared when Garland makes him fail at the start of Disc 3. It is this fear of dying unaccomplished that becomes his drive. Perhaps there is no better overarching theme than one that hits the entire cast, good guys and bad. Existential despair is a universal constant. Necron itself might not always be there, but think of it as a more fundamental force than a character, casting a long shadow over the plot. Necron is an avatar of existential dread. I don't think this is something unreasonable I'm asking from you. And it should be quite fair to say that it can put its metaphorical thumb on the scale as an avatar of a concept. Necron may have first shown its face, I mean this metaphorically, random wiseacre in the comments, at the very end of the game, but it has always been there. It has been the driving force of the game, ultimately. Which means that, during all of those sections where I talked about how Necron at best was only watching the show, maybe I kinda sorta lied through my teeth. But it was very specifically in the name of setting up the part where I say that maybe this whole thing is a matter of perception. It's easy to look at Necron being a name, a shape that only appears at the absolute end of the journey, and say that it was a meaningless thing that was never there, because it does seem to come out of left field. This makes Necron atypically subtle for a Final Fantasy villain. Additionally, Necron doesn't really take action until the very end. In FF3, as far as I've been led to understand anyway, the Cloud of Darkness communicates with Xand to make him do evil. I don't know how his name is actually pronounced offhand, so I pronounced it 2 different ways to be a problem. Necron's existence is as much a surprise to Kuja as it is to the player base. If the text of the game isn't enough to cement this, here's this bit I stole from the fandom wiki about something in one of the Ultimania books, which means it's doubly untrustworthy, but I'm putting it here anyway in case it's accurate and should be taken as canon. But there is nothing that directly casts Necron, as some individuated character, as being a prime mover directly. Necron did not scheme with anyone to create the conditions to justify its sentiments. It simply allowed things to happen a certain way. As an avatar of existential dread, it doesn't even have to actively directly manipulate anyone or anything. It exists, and by that virtue, it exerts gravity. Which brings me to looking at Necron's in-game design again. Perhaps this being a faceless horror isn't such a bad idea after all then. This faceless, mask-like design projects a degree of cold impartiality that this interpretation of Necron suggests, working as a fine counterpoint to Amano's design for Necron, which is practically just a face and more directly represents its cosmic horror-like status and its domain being that of a primal fear. This faceless Necron is perfect for something that could be called a blind judge. Even the holes that one could take as some sort of weird eyes if they were trying too hard are completely empty. Additionally, Amano Necron has a very dark color scheme, while Minaba Necron's is very pale. White is commonly associated with death and reincarnation, especially in Asia. Notably, it's a very common color of mourning in China. Again, paralleling Amano's Necron, also seen in a color associated with death and mourning. This pale coloration also helps Necron look like a marble statue or a plaster casting, perhaps resembling a death mask, commonly made of plaster of Paris. Ironically, death masks were, for centuries, meant to preserve the details of the face, whereas Necron has got some pretty chiseled abs, but not so much going on in the face. Still, I'm starting to think that Necron is actually kind of the perfect final boss for FF9. Normally, I'd just say this to be an annoying contrarian on the internet, but I think I've proven to myself that I'm serious about this one. How's that for a conclusion? We typically tell stories for a reason, even if that's just because we feel like it. Something which I don't think is as common as folks would have you believe, but will acknowledge exists. But that doesn't change that if all you look at from a story are its characters and plot beats, you will usually miss most of the story. Paying attention to the exact words will help you, but those words have meanings that you should pay attention to as well. I'm not talking about dictionary definition either. If you ignore the parts of a text that are not surface level and are told to you word for word, you'll fail to notice what the author is trying to impart. You'll miss the themes. From a perspective of pure narrative, maybe Necron is a little sudden, but thematically, it's cast a long shadow over the entire story. The characters may only fight it in that final boss, but they've been fighting it the whole game. It's always there. You never see the body or the name until the very end, but a character is much more than a physical presence or a name. So as strange as Necron is, I have to conclude that it isn't the worst final boss in Final Fantasy from a story perspective. Is it the best? Well, I don't know if I'd go that far, but it's exactly what Final Fantasy IX needs. Hey, I got a quick question for you. Do any of you ever think about the fact that this game has a character named Eiko Carol and Amaranth Coral? If you're anything like me, it bothers you just slightly, which is why it ends up taking over entirely. It's like having a mosquito bite, but on your brain. Oh, yeah, by the way, thank you all for watching. Do all the stuff that YouTube likes you to do. If you have a little bit of money and you would like to help fund me making more videos about video game stories and things of that nature, head on over to patreon.com/lunariandelia. You will gain access to videos 3 days early, plus there are a few exclusive things out there, old content that I did from channels that I deleted, stuff of that nature. Also streams at twitch.tv/lunariandelia. Currently, it's every weekday at 7 p.m. Central Daylight Time, which is UTC minus 5 hours. I'm sure you can figure out what time that actually is from there. Also, I have a new website where I post things that I've written at lunariandelia.neocities.org. For those of you who think that I have good words but poor line reading skills, which may not necessarily be wrong. And of course, thank you to all of my Twitch subscribers and my 2 patrons, Plastic Alan and Mile Marker. You are all fantastic. I'm hoping to have my next video out a little sooner than the month and a half this one took. It's because I did the last one at the beginning of the month and this one towards the end of the month. Oops. Originally, I had something slated for April Fool's Day that would be a little bit off topic, only a little bit, but that has become untenable, unfortunately. Anyway, yes, thank you all for watching, have a good evening, etc.